Thank you very much, Heather, and thanks to all of you for joining us this evening, and thanks especially to Oliver Sacks, who will talk to us tonight about his new book, The Mind's Eye, and other topics. The format for the next hour or so will be the usual one. I will be talking with Oliver Sacks about this and that for half an hour or so, and then we'll open up the conversation to questions from you. So the standard protocol here is that people who need no introduction get one anyway. It's a particular pleasure to be here with you tonight, Oliver. By way of full disclosure, I'll own up to the fact that you and I share a corporate connection. Both of us published some of our work, you for the New Yorker, under the auspices of the publishing behemoth Condé Nast, whose building in New York is known to writers as the Death Star. But it's a good Death Star, because it publishes you. Oliver Sacks is a professor of neurology and psychiatry at Columbia University, and he also holds the august title of Columbia University Artist, which I think means something like, do whatever you want. He was born in London, attended Oxford, became a doctor, and in the mid-1960s moved to the United States, where he has lived and worked ever since. By the 1970s, Oliver Sacks had added a burgeoning literary career to his clinical practice, producing one bestseller after another. Almost all of his books have been centered around accounts of acute and sometimes bizarre neurological disorders. But in Oliver Sacks's hands, we come to understand that the abnormal often offers a portal into the normal. Sacks is a superb stylist, and it obviously runs in the family. His first cousin was the late Abba Eban, the Israeli diplomat, and no slouch when it came to matters of the pen. We all use a kind of shorthand to describe certain genres of work, and everyone knows what you mean when you say an O. Henry story, a John Cheever story, a John McPhee story, and to this we can add an Oliver Sacks story. Oliver Sacks's latest book, his 11th, is The Mind's Eye, a series of case studies involving people with impairments to certain sensory capabilities. For instance, people who cannot recognize faces, people who cannot recognize everyday objects, people who cannot see in 3 dimensions, people who continue to write even though they have lost the ability to read. And as we'll see, and as I hope you'll explain, Oliver Sacks himself in this book comes under his own scrutiny in a deeply personal way. So it's a pleasure to have you here, and let me begin by asking a foundational question about how you came to pursue the interests that you have pursued. I know that as a boy you were deeply interested in chemistry. You were a child during the Blitz, and I know you have memories of the Blitz. I can't help but wonder how those scenes of physical and psychological trauma may have affected you. Could you just put us in mind of some of the formative experiences that turned your mind in the direction that it turned?
Well, in the war, I was evacuated and separated from my parents for 4 years and put in a school with a somewhat capricious, somewhat sadistic headmaster. And so when I returned to London at the age of 10, I very much wanted order and predictability, and science seemed to promise that, and chemistry in particular. But both my parents were physicians, and both, in fact, had studied neurology, but then gone on to general practice. The house was full of medical talk. My 2 older brothers were medical students and then doctors. There was a special interest in the visual, I think partly because I had visual migraine, and in attacks of visual migraine, colors may change, objects may flatten out, you may see giant scintillating arcs. I was very bewildered and frightened when I first had an attack at about 4 or 5, but I mentioned it to my mother, who also had such attacks, and she explained that this was, in terms intelligible to a 5-year-old, although I think a precocious one, that this was the visual cortex having fun, and that it would all settle down and leave no trace after a few minutes. And so what had been frightening then became, I think for me, an early and rather precocious portal, to use your word, into brain function, and gave me the strongest feeling that all experience was related to brain function. On the visual side, I was also passionately attached to photography, but in particular to color photography and stereo photography, which was a way of wondering how we construct color and depth. And in my first book on migraine, a third of the book is devoted to visual experiences, and vision has always been a hot topic for me.
And also a personal topic for you. You experienced something that has a long name that I can't pronounce, which is...
Prosopagnosia.
You do it very well, but you've had a lot of practice. Was that something also that you were aware of as a child, and can you tell us what that is?
I think not as a child, but when I was at high school, it was apparent that I had difficulty recognizing people. I could be with people all day and then 5 minutes later not recognize them. This was a source of embarrassment and annoyance and sometimes offense and sometimes outrage. It was thought that I was snooty or peculiar, and maybe I am in addition. But this brought home to me, although I don't think I mentioned it to others, that I had a peculiar difficulty recognizing faces, and that until people spoke, or unless they had some very striking single feature. For example, on the Amtrak train coming here, there was a train conductor with a gigantic beard who looked just like the Gauguin postman. I don't mean the Gauguin. Who do I mean? Yeah, okay. Also at that point, I became very fond of going for bicycle rides, but I got lost very easily. I sometimes didn't even recognize my own street, and so I always had to go with someone. And so I recognized then that I was deficient or defective in these areas, but I didn't know it was part of a syndrome. And I don't think I felt that way till I visited my brother in Australia, an older brother whom I hadn't seen for 30 years, and he had exactly the same problem. And then I thought the two of us must have some family genetic condition.
As I recall, there's a footnote in your wonderful book that relates exactly to this. You wrote a memoir called Uncle Tungsten, and as I recall, when you put a picture in of Uncle Tungsten, you put in the wrong picture?
Oh yes, and his family were furious, and it's my mother was one of, and Uncle Tungsten was one of 18 children, and I had 9 uncles. Now I put in another uncle, but Uncle Tungsten's children said the two of them looked nothing like each other. Anyhow, I corrected the mistake in the paperback.
So let's talk a little bit about your new book, because it bears directly on some of the issues that you've been talking about. So before getting to the personal part of the book, let me ask you about some of the case studies. They're united largely by the common theme of visual perception, or the lack of it. And they're deeply haunting, and in some cases they're actually inspiring and happy. A haunting story is one of a woman who can no longer read and can recognize colors but not shapes. So she tries to organize her life by grouping things according to color. and then gets thrown in the spice cabinet because everything has a red top. And then there's the story of a woman who has had, it's an opposite kind of story, a woman who has had monocular vision all her life, and then suddenly acquires stereoscopic vision later in life, and her entire view of things changes. And I wonder, can you give us one of these case studies and tell us why it is that that pathologies of vision seem to speak so centrally to our sense of ourselves?
Well, I get hundreds of letters a year, and from people who tell me of their experiences. Most of these are experiences of loss and sometimes cries for help. But a special and unusual one was related a very different experience. This was someone whom I'd met at a launch party some years before. Her husband was an astronaut. We got talking then, and she mentioned that she'd been born with a squint, with crossed eyes, and that though she'd had various operations, the eyes alternated, so she was only using one eye at a time. I asked if this affected her life much, and she said no. She said she could play a mean game of tennis, and that she sometimes teased binocular athletes by suggesting they wear a patch, and then they would miss the ball by 20 feet. And she could drive a car and do most other things. And I said to her, but can you imagine binocular vision or stereo? And she said, I think so. She said, I'm a professor of neurobiology. I've read all the relevant papers. So I left it there. But then 10 years later, she sent me a letter. She recalled this conversation, and she said I was wrong. And she said she knew, and now she could say this because in the interim she had developed stereo vision. And she said no information, no imagination could do justice to the wonder of it. She'd been to a vision therapist and had had some training, and then she said she went out to her car one day and the steering wheel was popping out the dashboard. And first she thought this was some bizarre mirage, something to do with the afternoon sun, but then she closed one eye and the other, and she realized this was it. This was the mysterious vision which everyone else had, or most other people had. She was enraptured with this, and many years later she's still enraptured. She says she said she couldn't imagine a parallel unless it were that of someone totally colorblind or who had never encountered colors suddenly being in a world of color. And there was a certain thinness and flatness to experience, and perhaps a feeling that she was looking at a picture and could not enter into a space. In some sense, in some way, she didn't have a sense of space, nor quite of herself as a being or a thing in space. And this is now changed completely, and something which one might think is as trivial as using two eyes rather than one is absolutely essential, I think, to one's visual being in the world. And so I was very struck by that.
And in recent years, you've had reason to be struck even more powerfully by this because one of the stories that is told in The Mind's Eye is Oliver Sacks going in the other direction. About a third of the book takes the form of diary extracts in which Oliver is recounting the progress in the aftermath of a disease. You're diagnosed with ocular melanoma. And And I wonder if you could take us through, in a brief way, that particular circumstance and what happened to you, how you coped in the aftermath, but come back also to this notion of seeing with one eye versus two.
Well, nearly 5 years ago, in just before Christmas in '05, it was a weekend, a Saturday morning. I started, as I do every morning, with a swim, and then I thought I would go and see a movie. And I was sitting watching the previews when I suddenly became conscious of some fluttering and a sort of sparking to my left. And at first I thought, this is one of those visual migraines. But then it was apparent that this was a different creature and that it was affecting one eye only, and was not in the brain, as a migraine is. And the fluttering became stronger. There was a brilliant incandescence, and then I realized that I couldn't see the lights in the cinema going out on the left, and a chunk of my visual field was missing. At that moment, I sort of panicked. I wondered what was happening. I wondered if the retina was detaching, if I was bleeding in the eye, if I was going to go blind. But I also didn't know what to do. So I sat still, hoping it would get better by itself. Well, it didn't. And that afternoon I went to see an ophthalmologist and described things to him. And he went and looked in my eye and then seemed to look at me in a different way. I had sort of been a colleague before. Now I was a patient. And he said I had something behind the retina, and he would refer me to a colleague. And I saw his colleague, who was in fact the man to whom I dedicate the book, a couple of days later. And I went through various tests, and then I was shown a model of the eye, and a black object, like a sort of wrinkled cabbage, a small black cabbage was put there. And this for me meant you have a tumor. It is a black tumor, it is a melanoma. And when I was a medical student, melanomas were a death sentence. But he was quick to say that melanomas in the eye were much more benign, they rarely spread, and they could be pretty effectively treated. That in the old days you'd remove the eye, but you couldn't let it stay there, but now you could radiate it. So I had radiation and lasering, and I had various visual symptoms, while more other ones, and I want to say more interesting ones. An area of the visual field was missing with that eye. This was a scotoma, but the scotoma for me was rather like a window, because I would see figures and landscapes and charming little hallucinations inside the scotoma. I could easily ignore these, but I was, if I had nothing better to do, I sometimes gazed at them. Later, I started getting very gross distortions with the vision in that eye. In this book, for the first time ever, I've put some of the grotesque drawings which I made. These include a drawing of people as I saw them at one point, when they were enormously elongated and attenuated and tilted to one side.
Now, you say that they're grotesque, but you also compare them to Van Gogh.
Well, no, that was the... I think actually the elongated ones, I think it's El Greco I compared them to.
Oh, that's right, El Greco.
Yeah, yes.
Right.
However, I would also sometimes, if I looked at a face or anything else there would be a sort of diffusion of the flesh and sort of protoplasmic, sort of translucent swellings would appear, and that reminded me a bit of Francis Bacon faces. And these would infect or infest vision generally, and I increasingly kept the eye closed or wore a pad, and the tumor was very close to my fovea, the fixation point with the most acute vision, and I knew that if that was destroyed, I would lose central vision in that eye, so-called. But by this time, then I did have a procedure which removed the rest of the tumor. In fact, this was a great relief, because instead of seeing grotesque distortions, I simply had no more competition from this eye. And effectively, I found myself one-eyed. Now, I loved stereoscopic vision. I mentioned that I used to do stereoscopic photography as a boy. I was an active, even ardent, even fanatical member of the New York Stereoscopic Society, which consisted of fellow nuts. Even when I was a little boy, I would find that closing one eye instantly flattened the world for me, though this was not so apparently for most people. So I thought I thought probably I was more biased towards stereo, and I probably saw the world more deeply than other people. And so I, who had such a passion for stereo, was now the first monocular member of the New York Stereoscopic Society. If I came in somewhat hesitantly, it's because I don't see steps. All I see is lines on the ground. I've accommodated to some extent. When I pour someone a glass of wine, I don't pour it straight into their lap, as I would do originally, though only to some extent. There's really the near and the far are conflated for me, as it were, on a single plane. I think I mentioned in the book that on one occasion, when my music teacher, my piano teacher, was introducing a new piece, I saw slivers of wood, twigs, coming out of her eye, or into her eye, and then I realized that in fact these slivers twigs were on a tree 200 foot away across the road, where she was 2 foot away, but I can't really distinguish 2 feet from 200 feet. I sometimes have stereo dreams. I love them. Stereo dreams, for me, were dreams of looking into a stereoscope. And now I still have these, but when I wake, it's to a very flat, cluttered world with no space between things. Everything is on top of each other. My fan is about to crash into my bedside lamp. I know that there's 6 foot between them, but so far as I'm concerned, they're about to collide. Oddly, though, it's a couple of researchers here at Harvard have suggested that Rembrandt, with his wide, I will come on to this a bit later, that Rembrandt, with his wide-set, slightly divergent eyes, could not have had binocular vision. They feel the same of some other artists who did self-portraits, and they feel, in fact, that binocular vision may interfere with the practice of painting or photography. With photography, of course, most people use a viewfinder, a single viewfinder. Of course, I had a stereo camera, but most people don't. And an artist will sometimes look through a tube, And they wondered whether renouncing or not having binocular vision might actually be an advantage to an artist. I thought this was an absurd theory until I lost my own binocular vision. And now I have to say the world is somewhat like a painting or a cinema screen. Before that, there were objects situated in space. Now there are only surfaces juxtaposed with one another.
Well, you'll be able to see some of those drawings for yourself in the book because you've reproduced about 10 of them.
Yeah, a few. The other thing, and possibly the reason why I hit the microphone, last year I had a hemorrhage in the eye which removed the little vision it had, and now I see nothing to the right of my nose. I can't see my hand, and losing this chunk of vision, well, one also loses it in one's imagination or one's mind's eye. The day this happened, or the day after, I ventured out onto Greenwich Avenue, a very crowded street in New York, and I was absolutely terrified because people suddenly materialized on the right. I got no warning, there was no peripheral vision to alert me, and I was crashing into them. And I went out with Kate, my assistant, an editor and friend, and she stood guard on the right. When I got back to the building, I got into the elevator and waited for her. And she didn't come, and I thought maybe she's checking the mail, speaking to the doorman, until her voice said, "What are we waiting for?" and I turned around with some difficulty, because somehow the idea of anything being on the right side has gone. I found she was there. Well, not only had she come in without my seeing her, but it hadn't occurred to me that she could have done that. And still, a year later, it doesn't occur to me that anything can happen there, although I have to make a special effort to sort of and to turn around and peer, and to sort of crane and peer at people disconcerts them. They feel they are being stared at.
So I chose my seat wisely.
Right, yes. No, I lose things and people to my right.
One of the issues that you talk about in your book, and it relates exactly to this, it has to do with the relationship between visual perception and simply the way the mind is structured to think. And you give an example, for instance, of a particular person who at one point had sight and then had lost his sight. And this person writes about the fact that over time, concepts like here and there lose meaning.
Facing.
And faces. Facing.
Yes.
Facing. And I wonder, can you talk a little bit more about that, this relationship between sight and the ordering of the mind?
Yes, well, these were described by, in a very remarkable book, a memoir by a man called John Hull, who's a professor of theology in England. I've sort of described my world as having become flat, and for me, near and far have disappeared. But if one is completely blind, I think one's entire sense of space may collapse or disappear, and of relationships in space, as when people are facing each other or two objects. For John Hull, space was recreated partly as auditory space, but the effects of losing a sense are very, very, very profound. This doesn't happen to all people who, when I wrote an article, I wrote a review of Hull's book, because I thought this was what might happen to all blind people. And I got an onslaught of puzzled and sometimes indignant letters from blind people who said this hadn't happened with them. Some of them said they'd lost their sight 30 years before, and they were still very visual. One woman said, I could see my hands as they're typing. And it became apparent to me then that there are many different responses to losing one's sight. I think the most striking was mentioned by an Australian philosopher and psychologist who was blinded by a chemical explosion when he was 20. He was told to turn to the other senses, and he refused. He was the son of a film director. His father would ask him to visualize scenes, and he determined to create a virtual world of sight in place of the actual one, and to have a sort of controlled hallucination, if you want, of the world. And he has become a virtuoso there, and indeed there's a whole category, a sort of subspecies of the visual blind.
It's fascinating. You just used the phrase about different responses to a particular trauma, and I think anyone who has read a lot of your work has that very matter in mind continually. On the one hand, you were presenting these case studies. You've done scores of them at this point. On the one hand, a reader's reaction is, my God, what a fragile thing my mind is. What little provocation it takes to alter it in some catastrophic way. And on the other hand, the reader also thinks, my God, what a durable thing my mind is. How inventive and adaptable it is. And this tension runs through many, if not most, of the case studies that you talk about. And I wonder if you could say a few words about that tension.
Yeah, no, well, you're exactly right. And I think this hit me, especially with my awakenings patients who had been felled sometimes overnight by a disease, and
you should say that these are sleeping sickness.
Sorry, yeah, by the sleepy sickness, and were then in some zombie-like state for decades, and yet when they came to, although some of them had lost 30 or more years of their lives, had dropped us through a vacuum from their 20s to their 60s, the 1920s to the 1960s, they were able to reconstruct their lives remarkably. But in general, as you imply, my enthusiasm and my theme is to do with survival. I love to see the different ways in which people survive after seemingly catastrophic things, and some of this is human consciousness and ingenuity, but some occurs quite automatically. Incidentally, I haven't mentioned animals, non-human animals, in this book, but I got a letter a couple of days ago from a woman who told me that...
I thought you were going to say from an animal.
She says her cat lost an eye in a fight, and she now observes that when the cat is going to pounce, it moves its head quickly from side to side and then pounces. So the cat didn't figure this out. It has happened. I think one of the most remarkable adaptations I describe in the book is with regard to a novelist, Howard Engel, a very good Canadian novelist, who one morning had breakfast, felt fine, went down to get the newspaper, which the Toronto Globe and Star, which looked okay at a distance, but which was unintelligible when he brought it to his eyes. He thought it was in some strange foreign script. He said it was like Serbo-Croatian. I don't know if there is such a language as Serbo-Croatian. And his first thought was that that this, in fact, had been printed for an ethnic minority in Toronto and has somehow been placed on his doorstep by mistake. But then when he opened the paper, all the advertisements were like that. He realized he'd had a stroke. He went into his library. He hoped books were different, but his entire library had become unintelligible to him. And as a lifelong passionate reader and a writer, he was terrified. This condition of suddenly losing the ability to read, or alexia, doesn't mean that one can't write. In fact, he could write, but he couldn't read what he'd written. And he didn't know how he could continue. Very remarkably, and this was not as it were, of his conscious doing, he started to find that he could read a bit. And he went to be retested, but the alexia was still total. But what was happening at that stage was that he was involuntarily copying letters with his index finger, and then moved on to involuntarily copying things with his tongue on the back of his teeth or the roof of his mouth. So reading for him became writing or copying with his tongue. And that works pretty well. But other people with alexia might find completely different ways.
Extraordinary story.
But as you say, we are infinitely fragile and infinitely tough, both.
So in just a moment, I'd like to turn this over to questions from the audience. So if you could think about your questions right now, and I'll ask you one more slightly embarrassing question.
I'm thinking of my sins. Yes.
It's not that embarrassing. But I hope you don't give the usual.
I mean, especially being in church. I'm ready to confess all. Yeah.
I'm not sure this church believes in sins, but for a person who reads nonfiction, you can't help but be struck how many physicians are terrific writers. You know, Lewis Thomas and Shep Newland and Jerome Groopman and yourself. You know, you almost think that instead of going to the Iowa Writers Program, you should go to medical school. And how did you learn to become the kind of writer that you became? Does it have anything to do with, you know, writing medical histories, or what is it?
Well, I never did a writing course or anything like that at school. Essay writing was a central thing in English and history. I've kept journals for more than 60 years, since I was 14. I sort of, there was an imperative need of something. If I was going through something unusual, if experience was intense, I had to somehow translate it or transform it into words. Now, both my parents, as I said, were doctors, and the house was full of medical talk. Doctors are storytellers, and I think, as you suggest, for me the case history became the central sort of exemplar or epitome of non-fiction writing. But although I haven't stuck to case histories, I've sort of written a few other things. I have to do it, and it somehow came to me. I should say that the first draft of what I write is often monstrously hyperbolic, and I depend on revising with a cooler head to get, and also on my good editors to cool the thing down and move me from contradiction and hyperbole to mild reasonableness.
Well, I wanted to ask you, and it's a pleasure to be here and to hear you speak. You were talking about catastrophic events, and my wife had a catastrophic event of having a stroke. And I was wondering, because you've talked a little bit about case histories and change of personality. My wife sort of struggled before the stroke with depression, but she's now had these incredible barriers of aphasia and spasticity and being confined to a wheelchair, and yet she's incredibly joyful. And I was wondering, could you speak a little bit about when someone's had a catastrophic event and that change of personality,
yes,
especially in that way?
Well, precisely such a change as you describe is described in one of the stories of my book about a woman prone to severe depressions who has a catastrophic stroke, is paralyzed and loses expressive speech, and realizes that her life, as it was lived before, in some sense was over. But in fact, this woman has become, my patient has become a sort of genius at communicating in non-verbal ways. And I mentioned her daughters wondered why she didn't commit suicide. But on the contrary, now she really was so glad to be alive and to be able to communicate, and that people's good feeling for her. I don't know how much was an organic change that in the brain, something sort of, as a lobotomy might do, and how much is just a reaction to having something catastrophic but surviving, and then life is infinitely dear to one, and one is infinitely grateful, and one feels it as a blessing.
Yeah. Very good, thank you.
It sounds like the microphone is working fine. Is that right for everybody? Great, thanks.
I want to thank you first for work which is based on inquiry and curiosity and not just a deficit model. I frequently work with people who have extraordinary ability in visual processing, memory, perception, with concomitantly weak auditory skills and vice versa. I wanted to ask if you see that frequently and whether you think it's ever the case that the prodigious strength keeps the weaker thing from developing as opposed to a model where you've got a compensatory mechanism.
Well, this is a good and deep question, and I don't know that it's going to be either or. Congenitally blind children, I should say that, absolute pitch is fairly rare, like 1 in 10,000. In professional musicians, it's 1 in 15. In the congenitally blind, it's 1 in 2. And this probably goes with the fact that the blind infant and the blind child has to suck all possible meaning out of the auditory world, and they become gifted that way. This can happen in adulthood as well. I mentioned how Hal, who had become blind in his 40s, found himself becoming more adept at creating auditory space to make up for the visual space which he lost. Something called Williams syndrome. All the people with Williams syndrome seem to be enormously sensitive to music, and many of them are gifted, whereas they have major visual difficulties. But then the front parts of their brain, they're also very, very talkative.
Yes.
And endearing and make contact. But with them, invariably, the front part of the brain is well developed, where music and language are involved. The back part of the brain, where vision is poorly developed. So this may just be the way their brain is. With dyslexia, which is now recognized as affecting 10-15% of the population, it's common to have visual gifts, whether it's a compensation or what. So I don't know. I mean, all I can do, in fact, all I do is multiply examples.
Thank you.
All right.
Good evening, Dr. Sacks. I'll start by mentioning something which I wasn't going to mention because I think you get a lot of questions on it, but given the previous gentleman's talk about traumatic or catastrophic injury, I've spent most of my spare time in the last 4 years researching Phineas Gage. And in the course of that, I've read a lot of Luria.
So in the course of that?
I've been reading a lot of Luria,
Yes.
Alexander Luria, and I was very struck by your introduction to his works and that you'd written probably very, very long ago. And I'd be interested to hear just any reflections you have about Luria. I found your treatment of him and as an introduction to, I hope I'm not putting you on the spot, perhaps.
No. Well, this is a, I'm not sure what to say of my idol.
I got that impression.
In 1968, Luria was a great Russian neuropsychologist. I should say a Soviet neuropsychologist, although he spent his entire life somehow dealing with the murderous bureaucracy, which could have put him in the gulag at any point. But in addition to pioneering detailed study of the brain, he loved to look at individuals in great depth and not just, as the previous person said, in terms of their deficits, but in terms of their impact, the sort of life they led. I read one of Luria's books called The Mind of an Eminist, about a man extraordinarily gifted in memory and imagery, but strangely defective in some other ways. I read the first 30 pages of this thinking it was a novel. And it had the pathos and the poignancy and the humor and the drama and then I realized, in fact, it wasn't a novel, but it was a case history, and the most detailed and, in a way, objective case history I'd ever read. But Luria's case histories have been a sort of model for me. But I could go on too long about him.
Well, thank you for the time. I really appreciate your reflections. Thank you.
Good evening, Dr. Sacks. Excuse me. I personally would like to thank you for your brilliant mind. And as a teacher, I was struck by your concept about survival for people who are struck this way. And it struck me that there's almost a model for how genetics works and how evolution works, where these people are given a genetic package that unless they choose to survive and or find a niche where that survival skill can flourish, that in fact could be a pathway to another genetic pathway into the future. And I was just struck by that, and I think I might use that in the classroom as I talk about genetics and evolution, because I think to a certain extent it happens to you. You're part of that process and when you're struck the way you've described. But I do have one short question. The people who have face blindness, do they use cranial accessories like eyeglasses and earrings and necklaces to, get through some of that vagueness?
Absolutely. So you would be remembered by your beard.
Oh, I see.
although you might be confused with other bearded people. And I should say, in relation to that, that I'm always apologizing to large bearded men in mirrors. And that on one occasion, when I was at a restaurant with tables outside, I got, as perhaps you do, I was sort of combing myself, and then I realized that my reflection was not combing itself, but that on the other side, inside the restaurant, there was a man with a beard who was puzzled as to why I was preening myself in front of him.
Thank you.
It has to be extraneous features. And this, incidentally, is a reason why I and other face-blind people find caricatures and cartoons easier to recognize, because a salient feature gets exaggerated.
Thank you very much, Dr.
Right.
Hi, Dr. Sacks. I've worked with autism for 17 years. Actually just met a colleague who I hadn't seen in a while here and read all your books. And I have a couple of questions about sensory integration, especially using sort of avant-garde techniques, trying to change the inside from the outside.
Yeah, I'm afraid I'm ignorant there, and I can't say anything on that.
Okay. All right. Berlin lenses or anything?
And the second question?
Okay. My second question is on synesthesia. If you'd like to comment on why colors seem to have specific emotions.
Incidentally, talking about with synesthesia, one sensation, one mode, one sense is converted into another one, so that, for example, one might see color associated with music. Sometimes, if one had absolute pitch with particular keys. This is not something which is. This is something which is built in. People who have synesthesia back to their first memories. The particular coupling they have never changes throughout life. And this is not just a metaphor or a fanciful way of doing things. If you, say, do functional brain imaging, you may find that when music is played, the parts of the brain concerned with color light up at the same time. A colleague of mine compares synesthesia to metaphor or to creativity. I think I disagree with him, because I think metaphor and creativity are essentially open and flexible, and synesthesia has a fixed and rigid, though often delightful quality. I speak in envy because I don't have it, except briefly if I'm stoned.
Why do certain colors have specific emotions? Is it frequency?
They made for you, but I don't think that's so generally.
I also wanted to ask about autism. I've read reports by parents who say that their children become almost normal when they have a fever. And I wonder if you've speculated about why that might be, or read any suggestive speculations about that. And then I also wanted to compare it to one of your patient stories. I'm told that children with autism, if you put them in front of a toy piano, will play one note indefinitely. It doesn't occur to them to move one note over one way or the other. And one of your patient stories concerned a man with Tourette syndrome who was a jazz pianist. And they gave him an antidopaminergic medication to control the Tourette's, which worked, but he found he couldn't improvise. So if I recall the story correctly, he went off his meds on the weekends so that he could play jazz, and then went back on it on Monday so he wouldn't curse at his wife at random times and things like that. And I'm wondering if a child getting autism and a child with autism getting a fever is sort of in the state of this guy going off his meds. Is dopamine more active during a fever, or do we have any other knowledge of what happens that might be useful in explaining this?
Right. Well, that's very interesting. I haven't heard that before, but I will try and sort of find out more. I think fever could have all sorts of effects on one, and it's one is usually not so much normalized by fevers as made delirious, but
Yeah, but I'm thinking for certain mental functions, it can be helpful to have more noise in the system. And for most of us, that perhaps fever gives us all a state of a higher noise to signal ratio. And for most of us, that might be bad, but perhaps for someone with autism, it would be a good thing. They make such incredibly precise distinctions, and they're unable to give them up. And maybe in a fever, they can give them up.
maybe.
I was reading recently about work involving people who are considered blind even though their retinas and optic nerves are fine because of some damage further back in the brain. And apparently in some of these cases, the people can actually see to a certain extent. Not read and watch movies, but distinguish objects and walk down the hall without bumping into tables, because some other area of their brain can take over. I wonder if you could elaborate on that, and if that maybe has something to do with some of the adaptations in cases where the eyes aren't actually destroyed.
Yeah, absolutely. Well, the term blind sight is used of this phenomenon when people who maintain that they see nothing will nonetheless, if they're asked to guess what is happening, what is being held in front of them, will guess right. They will guess that it's 2 fingers or 5 fingers, or that it's a cube rather than a sphere. And as you say, they may be able to thread their way around an obstacle course. And this can occur even if the visual cortex has been severely damaged. But it seems as if more primitive parts of the visual pathway can give one this sort of implicit, unconscious notion of vision. But then why should this be restricted to the blind? Maybe all of us have this sort of sight, as well as more conscious vision. One of my patients, the lady whom you mentioned, who finally became unable to recognize objects and had to organize them by color. But even though she couldn't recognize objects, sometimes she could instantly categorize them as living or non-living. And she had to use guessing as well. And sometimes in a fascinating way, one can guess right when one has no knowledge available to consciousness. I think this is a deep subject and perhaps one to end with. And certainly it's something we all use.
Because if the person can guess whether it's living or non-living, then a lot of complicated information is being processed somewhere.
Yeah, somewhere.
Okay. Thank you.
Okay.